So what you've just seen is not a traditional Advent scene. It was the cross. And below it there's a poinsettia to recognize the season in a rock which goes without really explaining, the rock that was rolled away. Why would we do that at the beginning of the second Advent of Christmas 2020? Well, simply being that we have an advantage over the first Christmas. We know what happened on the cross, and we know what happened when the stone was rolled away. That advantage sometimes is not great in that we tend to forget the actual story a little bit and the emotions and what the folks are going through. Second Advent is sometimes called the Bethlehem candle. That time is remembering Mary and Joseph and a baby traveling 90 miles through roads that weren't always easy. And we're remembering their journey, but we're not remembering just yet the arrival. We're not remembering the birth as of yet. We're thinking about all of what went before, the heartache of a young couple, the hardship of a young couple, the difficulty of not just traveling, but traveling when Mary was very, very pregnant. And so today, while we remember the cross, we remember that the advantage that we have is that we understand grace, we understand salvation, we understand a way of life built on that baby that was born, the teachings that came later. And so today we're going to simply talk about that second Advent, but it's important, I think, that we remember the cross as what's behind it all. Last Sunday we lit the first candle of Advent. We're going to light two today. And the second candle, which is the same color, it's purple, as the first one, today symbolizes faith. The first one was about hope. The second one is about faith. And when we light that, we're thinking about the faith that brought folks through the first Christmas and the faith that takes us through a season this year which is remarkably different than what Christmases have been in the last few years. I would invite you to join me as we light the candles. Merry Christmas, blessed Christmas. It's a rather wonderful story. The story of the first Christmas is full of history and intrigue and events that were almost unbelievable. There are very few stories quite like it. As a matter of fact, I would say there's none that rival it for birth stories. First Advent, as we talked about, is about hope. The prophecy of Isaiah of a child who was not much to look at, not much appreciated in his lifetime, but a child bringing hope to the world. Isaiah captures that essence of hope. The second Sunday of Advent is about faith. Hope is about something not yet realized, something in the future. It's going to happen, and it will be wonderful, but it's not here yet. And the longer we wait for hope, the harder it becomes to do so. We get tired after a while, and as the years go on, hope gets kind of shuffled to the background. We know it's there, but we're less and less conscious of it. And the folks in Israel at the time Jesus were born had been waiting hundreds of years for it. And in many ways, while they hoped for it, they didn't have a lot of faith that it was actually going to happen anytime soon. And that's where the second Advent comes in. Faith is how we work at hope. Faith gets us through the waiting times. But just like the fatigue of hope not yet realized, faith gets tired too. When faith gets tired, at least in my life, there's three ways that we can go. One, we get weaker and neglect to work at faith, and it just gets weaker and weaker and diminishes and fades away. The second option is we work at it, and we work hard to keep it fresh. And the third option is we put faith and hope into little boxes that we create in our minds and in our hearts, and we create a picture of what we want to see, and that box is our picture of that, and that becomes the focus of our faith, even if our box is not quite true. And inevitably, those boxes that we create are not quite the reality of what was prophesied, and so we tend to not be quite ready for what actually is coming. A lot of folks in Israel were of the third category. The picture of what they hoped for became so entrenched that when that hope was realized, when it came true, they didn't believe it. Isaiah told them it would be that way, but by the time Jesus was born, most of them had kind of forgotten those words or overlooked them. In particular, they forgot the words about the Messiah not being a warrior king. They had a very different picture in mind of what they wanted to see happen. And because of that, Second Advent is very humbling. It's a truth prophesied by Isaiah, but not the truth that Israel wanted. Often called the Bethlehem candle, the Second Advent is a time that we remember two young folks who knew the truth when most others refused to believe it. Mary and Joseph knew the truth about how the baby Mary was carrying had been conceived. They knew the accusations against them were false. They knew hope was coming true, and they were lonely in living out that truth. Faith can be quite often a lonely journey. When God puts someone else in that journey, it's really quite remarkable and it's quite special. And Mary and Joseph were on that journey together. They were each other's support. And yet, though they knew the truth of how Jesus was conceived, they didn't know the whole truth either. They too had likely put their hope and their faith into a little box of their own making, the making of their culture. All they knew was what the angel had told Mary, and I read directly from Luke 1. "Don't be afraid, Mary, you found favor with God. You will conceive and you'll give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus." And here's the part that would have confused them. "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David." And in truth, they wouldn't have been confused because that's how Israel wanted to think about the Messiah that was coming. And Mary would have thought about her own child in those terms. Mary and Joseph on the journey to Bethlehem together is what we remember on this day of Advent, but it didn't start that way. In fact, the together part nearly never happened. When Joseph found out Mary was pregnant, he wanted to end the relationship. He knew what he thought was the truth. Mary was pregnant, but he'd had nothing to do with it. Joseph was alone, betrayed by the woman he thought would be his wife, at least in his own mind, and his world had collapsed. On the other side, with the exception of Elizabeth, a relative, Mary was alone for the first trimester of her pregnancy. Just like Joseph, the loneliness was prevailing. The words of the angel must have given her hope during that time. Mary must have been encouraged, thinking her son would be a king one day. It was good to think of her son as a hero, honored by all of Israel, and yet the reality is, what would Joseph do when she returned to Nazareth? Would she be shunned? The answer to that was easy, of course. Would she be stoned? And that was an open question at the time. She very much ran the risk of losing her life through being pregnant, and everybody thinking that this was a child born when the two were not yet married. Just as an aside, have you ever wondered why folks sometimes take drugs or any drug that'll offer the reality just a bit? If you were in Mary or Joseph's sandals, wouldn't you want reality to be just a little bit different than it was? It'd be tempting to chill out for a time, just to forget the reality you really didn't want to live. The support of Elizabeth and the personal relationship with God must have kept Mary away from some of those things on a healthy path. How many folks don't have that relationship with God or a relationship with another person who is just there for them? I think of that on the second Advent when I think of these two young people thrust into a world that they didn't imagine would ever be theirs. When Joseph first saw Mary pregnant, he had no angelic words to help him along. He didn't have an Elizabeth in his life. Perhaps he had a friend, but the Bible doesn't tell us that. We get the impression he was very much alone. Until one night, the angel came to him too and said, "Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She's going to give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." And that's from Matthew chapter 1. With that message, Joseph had everything Mary had and a little bit more. He had that relationship with God, now that the angel had spoken directly to him. And he had that relationship with Mary, someone who understood and was going through the same thing that he was. With faith in those two messages from an angel, these two young people were together on a journey. They knew the truth of the pregnancy. They knew also what it was like to be judged and shunned because so few believed them. They could support each other. They could experience the journey together. Joseph had begun the journey as a young man, asking a young woman to share his life. The hope and happiness of that was shattered when he saw her pregnant for the first time. It took an angel to put that all back together. Mary began her journey as a teenager, planning for a wedding. Suddenly she was pregnant, and knowing nobody would believe her, she in fact ran away. Thank God for Elizabeth. Thank God for an angel who helped her who helped Joseph believe her. Their togetherness and their faith is what took them one day, near the end of the pregnancy, on a 90-mile journey. They would have gone south along the Jordan Valley and then west across the hills near Jerusalem to Bethlehem. The weather would have been unpredictable. In some places, bandits were operating. They would have had to carry their own food, and likely it would have taken them close to a week. But we've been forgetting something. This is not a story just about two young people. It's a story of three people: Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, who was yet to be born but was very much alive. The entirety of their marriage to this point had been about three people. Why else would folks have judged them and shunned them? Perhaps, there were some folks who were more forgiving than others. You may have run into some like that, who would say, well, young folks, they'll be young folks. Hormones will be what they are. They're married now, it's okay, it's good. But most people would have judged and they would have gossiped. Some would have refused to do business with Joseph, and all in all, it wasn't a very happy way to begin a marriage. But they were married, and they knew the secret of how Jesus came to be, till one day it would be time and he would be born. They were on that journey. And then they were forced to go to Bethlehem so they could pay proper taxes. That was what a census was all about. It was all about money, economics. Mary could have stayed behind and probably should have. She should have stayed with her mother, who could help her through her first birth, her first pregnancy. It would have been a good thing. No one knew how that first pregnancy would go. Better to be with mom and better to be with the midwife in Nazareth, in her hometown. Yet, she went on that journey with Joseph. I like to think the words of the angel gave them a special bond as they traveled. I like to think it brought them together. Something that was just for them, something of wonder and intensely private that they shared. I like to think that's what brought them together on this journey, when it made more sense for Mary to stay behind. It is that journey together, the three of them, we remember in Second Advent. The 90 miles of that journey led to the birth of Jesus in the town prophesied of old. It has become one of the stories of the Old Testament realized in the New. But for a young couple, it was just them, with the words of an angel, traveling together into a world that they didn't understand and few others understood. Mary and Joseph did not know the future. They did not know their child, 33 years later, would die a death few parents could even imagine and none would hope for their child. All they knew is that they were waiting for a birth, together with the assurance of an angel. The full life of their son is part of that journey to Jerusalem, but those two young people didn't know that. We do. All they knew is the child was conceived by the Spirit of God, and they were going to raise this child. In faith, they walked on. In faith, they went 90 miles. In faith, they believed their child was a hope prophesied for by Isaiah. In faith, when others did not believe, they continued their journey, of which 90 miles were just a few on the path they needed to walk, and that their son would need to walk. I was listening this week to an audiobook in which the author was exploring the relationship between belief and a way of life. And the challenge was whether belief resulted in a way of life that supported those beliefs. And the second part of that challenge was so often in the church we say what we believe, what we're for and against, but our way of life doesn't match that. Christianity has so for very many been simply about what people are for and against in judgment. And the criticism that we as Christians don't live that day to day has often been a valid critique of the church. The story of Second Advent has a lot to do with that. It's such a beautiful story of a young couple facing challenges and overcoming them, working together so their baby could be born. The beauty of that story is exceptional. But there is another side to it too. The religion of the day meant they were judged. They were not believed. The distortion of Isaiah's prophecy meant there were beliefs there that shattered at the credibility of the story of a virgin birth. People had a different image in mind of what that would be. Even when the child grew up, what he taught was not lived out by most folks. There were 12 disciples who became apostles and some others, and the church began very, very small. And I think that's our challenge this week, the second week of Advent. Do we live it out with compassion, love, and understanding? Do we live out the message of Jesus with love, with compassion, and with understanding? Do we qualify what we say to others by saying, well, I don't agree with you, or I'm not happy with what you're doing, but I'll love you anyway? Or do we just stay silent when we need to stay silent and just through our actions show that we love and we're compassionate and that we care? Mary and Joseph knew what it was like to be judged. Sometimes they didn't hear the second part, which is, I will love you, because all that was said was judgment. They lived in a broken world, as do we. They had dreams that were shattered and put together. Thankfully, they had an angel and a God to do that. How many of us today live in a shattered world? How many people around us live in a shattered world and we don't tend to see it? Are we a little bit like that angel, asked to help folks put their lives back together? I've been thinking about that this Advent season. Am I, as a follower of Jesus, or as we, as followers of Jesus together as the church, are we helping folks heal through love and compassion, or are we making the wounds deeper by our actions? I don't know the answer to that. But I do know Second Advent drives me to ask the question. Mary and Joseph had each other, and they had a personal relationship with God. It took them time to get there, but once they did, the journey was not quite so lonely once they got to realizing they needed to be together. Who do I know who's lonely this week? Can I be the person, can you be the person who is just there without judgment, alongside to help and be a friend? We can be part of the answer, but not all of it. We can be that person, but we can also introduce them to Jesus Christ so they have the full benefit of support and comfort in this Christmas season. I do believe Jesus is the answer. And Second Advent calls me to live that out, not as a set of rules and regulations, but as a way of life that breathes compassion and love in the name of Jesus Christ. May the Lord be with you as you live that out in your own life. Blessings to you on this second Sunday of Advent 2020.